Okay, so hey guys, welcome to another classroom session. I'm not sure if this one's gonna last as long as the previous ones, but I wanted to cover some fundamentals that might help you with just general assignments, and not only this week's assignments. We'll be applying it to this week's assignments, of course, but I'm sure it will help you in a lot of different ways. So what we'll be covering today, or what I at least want to cover, is that how we can, again, break up complex shapes into primitives, and how we can use shape welding and subtraction to do that. We'll also look at how we can tilt planes instead of mirroring complex shapes, which is a lot harder to do. And just by tilting planes and using projections, we can actually almost become or get the same results without having to draw too many guidelines. And then we'll go into a bit of gesture drawing with the mannequin and see where there's a difference between internal gesture and contour gesture. Okay, so let's get started. Just setting things up. Okay, so the first thing that I want to cover is what is known as shape welding, or shape addition versus shape subtraction. And basically what it is that we combine primitives, where we use the simplest primitives to get new shapes in general. So this can be graphically, this would be represented with simple 2D shapes. Of course, we'll be looking at it in 3D, where we are combining, for instance, boxes and cylinders. Now, the thing is going to be that when you are looking at complex shapes, that you can, for yourself, problem solve the complex shape at hand and break it down into its most primitive. Now, its most primitive does not mean, and we'll look at this with an example in a minute, does not mean a straight cylinder and a rectangular box, right? The box can be manipulated in many different ways, as can the cylinder, right? And so that's what we'll look at. And that's what you'll kind of need to learn for yourself to do when you're looking at complex shapes. We'll also be looking at subtraction. So that's basically what we'll be doing with all these complex shapes. And so if we have a sphere, for instance, like this, we're subtracting a shape from it and creating, for instance, half a sphere, right? Or a quarter sphere, right? So that's subtraction. Same for a box. If we have a standard box, we can subtract something from that box and create a different shape. So that's what we're doing internally when we are looking at complex shapes. In the beginning, however, it would be good for you to train it using these simple shapes so that you can really get a good grasp on perspective, first and foremost, and just problem solving in general. Because all of this, all like drawing in general, painting in general, it's problem solving. And you'll begin to notice throughout this lesson in particular that a good sense of perspective is really pivotal in understanding complex shapes. Okay, so now if we apply these rules to the samurai helmet first, when I look at the samurai helmet, we have a couple of things, right? And I don't know all the Japanese names, but basically we have what covers or protects the head, right? Which to me is represented by half a sphere. No, Siri. Siri always wants to interrupt me. So we have half a sphere. And then we have the neck guard, right, which protects the back of the head and the neck. And at that stage, you already might have some trouble with figuring out, okay, how do I break this down into a complex or a simple shape? And when I look at the neck guard, what I see is basically a cone that is cut in half. So something like this, right? And that attaches to the back of the helmet. And then we have the flaps, which are called fukugaishi or something. They're there to protect swords from coming into soft tissue areas of the face. And if I look at them in the beginning, for me, they are just basic cylinders that have been manipulated. And we'll look at how they are being manipulated just in a minute. And then we have the front flap of the helmet, which is also, to me, just half a cone. Like this. And if we combine these things together, we basically get the gist of a samurai's helmet. Okay. Now, these are super basic shapes, but we can then use, because up until this point, I've used some simple breakdown and simple subtraction, but we can add more subtraction to this to get more complex shapes. So, for instance, the helmet basically stays the same, half a sphere, right? But then instead of this neck guards being represented as a cone cut in half, what it essentially is it's a curved plane at the back of the head, the helmet, that tapers out. And the way that we can represent that is by, and I'm going to use another color, is by punching a hole into this half cone, right, and cutting out this area. Right. So actually what you would do in a 3D program is you would create that half a cone, and then using another primitive, you could cut through that shape, and then eventually creating that resulting shape. So for me, that will look like something like this. Adding some thickness. Okay. And then the flaps that I've had represented by these cylinders, in essence, I'm taking away, or I'm subtracting almost everything from that cylinder, except for this part, right, which I'm keeping. So if we do that here, we get something that looks like this. And this. And then we do the same thing that we did for the neck guard on the top of the helmet, and we just cut away this portion. And we add that to the front of our helmet. And keep the center line. Okay, and so when we are drawing, or when you're looking at this complex form of the helmet, that's kind of what you should be thinking about to problem solve those complex shapes. So far, does that make sense? Or do you have any questions regarding that? Okay, cool. All right, so, and then if we look at the chest piece armor of the samurai, basically we're doing the same thing. We're adding and subtracting shapes in order to get that resulting shape. Because when we look at that chest armor, in the beginning it might look a bit complex, where it does things like this, goes in, you know, it's even divided in two, right? And it has all these armor pieces. It's even divided like this, right? So in the beginning, that might look quite complex to, you know, to wrap your head around. Again, what you should do, or try to do in the beginning, is think about the most basic shapes. And that's what I was saying here in the beginning. Those basic shapes are not just this cylinder and this box, because this box would have no place here. But a variant of this box would. So, in my eyes, the simplest way that I can manipulate this, this shape is by thinking of it as a basic cylinder first, and then adding a box on top, but a very small sheet of a box, right? Almost more like a sheet than a box. Of course, because this is straight, it wouldn't look natural if I added this to the cylinder. So I need to bend, let me use another color. I need to bend this box in order to get the resulting shape that I want for it to fit onto that cylinder. So let's do that. We're rounding off that small sheet of a box like this, and then we're combining it onto a cylinder. Now, of course, practically, having the armor as a straight cylinder doesn't work, because our rib cage and the upper part of our torso is much larger than our waist. Something needs to give a little bit, right? So the bottom of that chest piece is smaller. So what do? We essentially create kind of a cone where we decrease the size of the ellipson at the bottom of this cylinder, right? And so we do the same thing. Like this. And then in the final step, because the cylinder has to follow the rounding of our body, it kind of gets inflated in the middle where the sides kind of bend just a little bit. So again, do that. Bend it a little bit inward. Like that. Okay. Now we have this resulting shape, but that doesn't yet make up this shape. And I'm not sure how many of you have followed the rounding videos that I made on the website. It's basically where we learn how to round off corners. Right, like this. That's basically what happens with this box sheet on top of that cylinder. So in the end, what we're doing is we're rounding off this corner and we're rounding off the connection between that sheet and the cylinder, and as well on the underside. And that's kind of the process, the thought process that you can go through when you're thinking about copying these armor pieces. Right? And then once that becomes clear, cutting it in half, right, kind of becomes a piece of cake. That's why I'm requesting the hardcore people in the assignments to, especially for day 2, to try and do an exploded view of the armor, just to enhance your spatial awareness a bit more, because it then doesn't matter which way your mannequin is positioned, even if it's like in a let's say a super extreme angle like this, right? If you've trained your perspective, that the chest piece is probably going to fit onto that body. Like this, right? And when you get a good understanding of this, stylizing it becomes easy, right? Then it's just a matter of adding cool shapes or stretching things a bit more than they need to be stretched. And then it just becomes a thing of personal flavor and style. But understanding these principles will help you a lot with your problem solving, and especially with your, figure invention and designing from imagination. So that's basically what I wanted to say about welding and subtracting. Do you guys have any questions surrounding this subject for now? No questions? We all good? All right, cool. Well, should you come up with any other questions, feel free to ask. And then on the subject of these complex shapes, what I also wanted to briefly cover is tilting planes and projections. The reason that I'm giving you guys the assignment in day 1 where you have to project a complex shape that sits within a box, right? One of the main reasons is that it's just a lot easier to do than trying to mirror planes in perspective, because you need all of these guidelines in order to do that. So for instance, when we look at the decorative element of the samurai's helmet, right, it can look very daunting and very complex. Right? If we add one of these decorative elements, it might look very intimidating to a beginner or to any view, because it's just an unordinary shape, and it's tilted in perspective, and it can shift all kinds of ways. So what I usually think about is exactly the assignment that I gave you on day one. Basically, I just regard it as a plane in perspective. So if I need to break down that complex shape, all I'm doing, let's say that we're looking at it, from above. Like this. I just regard that decorative element as a simple plane in perspective. I'm not drawing it like a plane, but that's what I have in my mind. And then I project onto that plane this more complex shape. Okay, and I think the largest difficulty that many of you can have with tilting planes is that, okay, but how do I tilt planes consistently in space? For instance, like we have a helmet like this. Right. So how do I tilt this plane? And the best tip that I can give you, and this is from personal experience, there might be another or a better way to do it, but the way that I think about plane tilting is that I kind of place this plane into a cylinder. So for me, it becomes easier to tilt this plane any way forward, any way I like, because what I'm basically considering is the cylinder in which they occupy those planes. And I'm gonna do this with a simple example. So we have a plane in perspective, which is already tilted. And now I want the same plane tilted even further, or more moved upwards. What I think about is the hinge point at which that plane will tilt, which in this case will be this hinge point, right? And coincidentally, which isn't coincidentally at all, this hinge point will serve as the minor axis for my cylinder. And if you guys don't know what a minor axis is, please look at the cylinder video. So I use this as a minor axis for my cylinder. And then I can, let's extend this, right? And then I can just guess, or I can draw it as well. The other side of the cylinder. And then I can just connect, keeping my perspective in mind, of course. Whichever way I want, how this plane is actually turning. I'm gonna mute you again because you were making a lot of noise. Okay, so right, these planes are now occupied by that cylinder, and it gives me the freedom to just tilt it whichever way I want. And within that box, I can now project my complex shape. Which makes it a lot easier. Right? Does that make sense for you guys? Yeah. So basically, the real secret is that everything's cylinders, okay? Knowing how to draw cylinders, as I said in the beginning of Aardwad, is very, very crucial. And I'll show you another example as well. But for instance, if you want to draw a character having two katanas standing cool, and you kind of want to make it look good in perspective, let's just draw a mannequin. All right. Let's say this cool samurai guy is holding two katanas, evenly distributed, right? It's not that visually interesting that it's evenly distributed, but maybe, for design purposes, you need to do that. So the one katana would be like this, and the other one would be like this. Now, how do I know that this is kind of symmetrical? Well, all I'm really thinking about is first my perspective. Maybe I can use pencil for this. So the perspective that is occupied by this mannequin, right? And then I'm basically projecting a tilted plane within that perspective. And so for me, that is kind of this tilted plane. And we can add some volume to it because the katanas have volume. Right. And so that I'm just thinking about this blue box. I've already muted you again. It's okay. So I'm just thinking about this blue box, and I'm projecting the swords or guns or whatever I want within that box. That gives me a nice guideline to get a rough estimation of symmetrical objects, right? And maybe the katanas aren't the best example, but Let's see if I can still draw on this base. Some of you might have some trouble with drawing like horns, for instance. So instead of this decorative piece, we want to draw horns. Right. Now, to maybe get a better idea of how to draw these horns, what I again anticipate, or how I problem solve this, is that we have our helmet in perspective. This is our center line. This is the perspective plane upon which it stands. And the horns, basically the minor axis running through those horns, is where I will project my plane. So I'm following, this is, let's say we put the horns on the center line of our helmet. I'm following that center line of that helmet, going up and finishing my plane in perspective. And upon that plane, I am now projecting the minor axis for my horn. Okay, and then around this, all I need to do is just add volume, right? And if you have trouble with flexible minor axes, look at one of the fundamental videos where I talk about bending cylinders, right? Basically, if you want to create a horn, you basically have a normal cylinder instead with a minor axis like this. Instead of a straight minor axis, we bend the minor axis, right? And we create the same shape. And if you continue this, you essentially get a horn, right? And that's basically what's happening here. We just have multiple minor axes, if that is even a word, right? That have their own cylinders making up a horn. Okay, but that's a lot easier, in my opinion, to think about this projection on this plane instead of trying to figure out, okay, I have this complex horn like this, and now I need to mirror that onto the other side. So I need to create a center plane, and then I need to figure out what the center shape is. I need to project that, project it down, project this down, project this down, then multiply that to the other side, you know, just in the Scott Robertson way, until I get all these points, and then I can mirror that, right? It's just so cumbersome. And if you get a bit more comfortable with perspective, what you can basically do is just think about tilting planes and projecting complex shapes onto those planes and then building them out with volume. Okay, so that's basically what I wanted to cover with these complex shapes. Let's see. Okay, yeah. So maybe one thing that might help, which is kind of a Scott Robertson way, is that we have these flaps, right, that I've indicated earlier. these Fukigaishi. I have it written somewhere. Hold on. Flaps are called Fukigaishi, yeah. I'm butchering that word, but that's what they're called. Okay, so we have these flaps, right? And they should be kind of symmetrical in your designs. Now, how do I create a tilted cylinder and make the exact same cylinder on the other side? Well, what you could do is you can think about a center plane. In this case, we'll call this our center. You know, our helmet is here, but this is our center plane. This is the center line of my helmet. What I can do is think about the minor axis of this cylinder, extend that towards the center line, which is here. See where that connects with the center, the minor axis here, and then you should be using this multiplication of boxes where we find the center line, which is somewhere over here. We project that to the other side, which makes this part equal to this part in perspective. And then we can draw a line like this, where these two lines meet. And that would give me a rough estimate of where I would need to place my other cylinder in perspective. But as you can see, this is quite cumbersome, but it does help you to mirror tilted planes in perspective, especially when it becomes a little more complicated. But going as detailed as the How to Draw books, where you go super technical, is, in my opinion, a bit overkill, because we want to draw things with a certain amount of believability, whether it be stylization or very realistic. But it doesn't always need to be technically accurate, right? That's up for the 3D modelers or the engineers and stuff like that. But as artists, we want to make it believable, volumetric, and stuff like that. But having an estimation with some nice style is, in my opinion, always better or more pleasing to look at than having something that is super technically accurate. Okay. Right, so that's it on the topic of shape manipulation. Does anyone have any questions about that? When you draw the whole figure, how are you able to add facial features when the head is so small? Well, that's not really a question for this classroom. Again, so I'll leave that for another time. Right, so does anyone have any questions regarding the face shape manipulation? Regarding the ornaments, again, it's suggesting it is step one, and then you can add as much detail as you want. As soon as you've established the structure of your drawing, adding detail on top of it becomes very easy, because then it's just following the structure that you've already established, right? Whereas sometimes in the beginning of the Samurai Week, someone said like, oh, I hate drawing samurai armor because it's so complex. And I think that's where many beginners fall into the trap of starting with the complex shapes, starting with the details, and trying to draw those in perspective. Same as with any other like anatomy or facial features. in the beginning, don't try to draw the facial features in perspective or in difficult angles, right? Because that's just setting yourself up for failure. Instead, try to regard the most basic shapes and then add complexity to those shapes, and then maybe add some anatomical structure to those shapes, and then maybe add anatomical detail, but in that order. How do you keep stuff not stiff using such structure? Every time I use system like that, I end up with really weird stuff. It sucks that cylinders are the most important thing since I suck at them so badly. I think the stiffness in your drawings, Argus, is primarily because you're still afraid to manipulate the basic shapes. Like I said, here with the horns, you're too focused on the straight structure, and the simple box and the straight box and the stiff box. But there's so many ways to manipulate these simple shapes, right? Just by bending them or inflating them or squishing them, right? And when you do that, you already create a lot more interest into your drawings. A lot like the old-time animators. Yeah, exactly, TW. It's all about mileage in that case. I've drawn so many things in so many perspectives already that it kind of becomes easier to estimate where things go. But in essence, you can exponentially boost your learning when you're thinking about these principles. All in good time, Tanya. All right, so then just a little bit about gesture. And this is actually, Argus, where you can also add and breathe a lot of life into your characters. Gesture is basically how you add, in general, gesture, but add interest to your posing and your characters, even when they're standing still. Gesture doesn't mean that it needs to be an action pose, but of course, in action poses, it will be more prominent. And that's something that you'll need to, do in this week's assignments as well, making dynamic figures. And I don't know how much experience you guys have with gesture drawing, but there's not like real secrets to gesture drawing. I think the simplest way to think about it is that you have one big line of action that kind of entails most of the pose that you're trying to draw. Most of the time, this line of action is either determined for the spine of the body going into the legs, or the legs themselves, or the arms, right? And I think one of the absolute best real life, well, not real life, but examples in the art world to really practice your gesture is looking at Spider-Man comic books, because they're just filled with that gesture, right? If you look at, if we look at just gesture in general, we can add like a curved line for the legs, and then maybe just a simple curve for the arms, right? And then it becomes a matter of adding your flexible mannequin, basically, to that gesture. Of course, primarily you'll need mannequin knowledge, but you'll need some anatomical knowledge as well to make things look more interesting. But you can already add a lot more life into your characters when you use gesture or when you follow gesture properly. Okay, so let's do another one. So a curve for the spine going into the legs, and then another one for the other leg, right? Just two basic lines. And then we can start adding even your box mannequin on top of this. It just becomes a bit of a good practice to start manipulating those simple shapes. So instead of just drawing a stiff cylinder, we draw a dynamic cylinder, right? And then the more anatomical knowledge you gain, the more anatomical those simple shapes can look, right? Instead of it just being a cylinder like this, right? The leg can, for instance, have a little bit of musculature like this, right? And the calf can also have some musculature, right? But basically that's all you need. You don't need that much anatomy indication. You do need anatomy knowledge, but you don't need that much anatomy indication. That's a big difference. As you can see, these simple gestures just add a lot of life into your characters because they're basically following a rhythm. And I think that's where a lot of drawings also get pretty stiff, is because there's not any rhythm into the drawing. And that's actually why gesture has been invented, I think, not only for simplification, but also adding a maximum of readability into your drawings. Because we can internally, when non-artists look at these drawings, they can follow what's going on, right? And a mistake that a lot of us make, especially in the beginning, I did it as well, is that we want to make dynamic poses separate from each other. So we start with a cool head, and then we make a torso, then we make arms, but our gesture isn't there anymore, right? It's like fragmented all over the place, which doesn't give a nice coherent posing and shape. Right? Everything shapes. So that's basically why gesture drawing is so important, and why things like Quick Sketch can really help your drawings, right? So, but all in all, most of the time, the gesture will be indicated from the head into the spine and maybe into one leg, and then maybe a gesture for the arms and the shoulders, and another line for the legs. This is not a rule, but this is how many artists seem to use it. Yeah, sure. Tanya, definitely do gesture drawing even though you haven't nailed down your proportions yet. It can still really help, add dynamic, just a dynamic sense to your characters. And just practicing proportion is also just a matter of mileage, just like perspective. It does take some form of feedback, whether it's professional or from other people, to tell you that things are off in some areas, but you'll probably see that yourself. That's the good thing about, practicing characters, is that we are used to drawing or seeing people in real life so much that we can already tell when something is off in our own designs, right? And then it just becomes a matter of mileage to really nail down those proportions. Okay. So any questions about this type of gesture? Because this is what I call internal gesture. I've covered it very briefly. I'm not. I wouldn't say I'm the expert in gesture. It's just that that's what I get from gesture drawing, and that's what you can practice into your gesture drawing as well. Just gonna wait if Argus still has a question. Yeah, grounding figures again. Argus kind of comes down to perspective drawing as well. That's where it really helps to ground your figures. If your perspective is kind of off, along with the proportions, things will almost never seem grounded. There's also some gesture involved, but not that much as you would think. If you have trouble with that half tree, again, just consider the simplified mannequin that I discussed in the figure tutorial, of just adding like some sort of speedo, right? And a manipulated cylinder. And if you practice this enough, then you can add maybe some anatomical indication to make it look more believable. Okay, so going forward, this is what I call internal, right? With a big I. Internal gesture. And I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the book Force, right? That also seems to cover a lot of gesture drawing, and it really does, right? But you have to be careful when you're a beginner, because this is very advanced gesture drawing, because it's based on very good and anatomical understanding as well as design, okay? And the reason I'm telling you this is that sometimes people get frustrated when they're doing where they're learning gesture drawing, and they get frustrated when they try to apply things like the book Force. The reason that is because, and we'll just create another segment here. Oh shit! This is supposed to be a C, guys. All right, this is a C. So contour gesture is what I call it, right? The reason it's contour, it's not really contour because there's also internal shape design, but it usually covers a lot of the outer section of the figure. For instance, if we take a figure, so what they'll do in Force is that, for instance, they will create like the torso, like this, going into the glutes, connecting with the iliac crest, like this. Right, and then they'll have something like this, and then okay, so this is a little bit exaggerated, but the thing, what they're doing in these Force books is that they're actually finding a balance between anatomy and design, and primarily straight lines versus curved lines, right? So they'll look for that in every possible way, but having a very good understanding of how the anatomy underneath functions. Right. So, for instance, they will indicate the latissimus and they'll simplify a lot of the anatomy, but they have a very good understanding of what that anatomy is. Right. So it will create a lot of dynamic and movement into your drawings, and it's definitely something that I use, but you should just be aware that it's not the most common way to do gesture drawing, right? It's pretty complex and advanced because it just requires you to know a lot about anatomy. And again, I know. That's why I kind of wanted to warn you guys to some degree, because don't get me wrong, I'm not saying anything against the books, because I use their teachings. It's absolutely fantastic, but it does require a lot of understanding when you're doing this. It takes a lot more, like I said, anatomical understanding and design understanding, especially like straights versus curves. And they'll usually use like curved lines for everything that's flexible, and then use a straight, and then they'll offset that with a straight and a curved. And basically what they're always trying to do is have one curve flow into another. And another artist, old master that does this is Bridgman, right? He also is always looking for one form wedging into another form, because it just creates rhythm, right? That's actually where it comes from. So definitely a very good book. Very, very good to learn from, but it's very advanced. So I wouldn't recommend it if you're starting out with gesture drawing and mannequin drawing and figure drawing in general. It's something that if you feel comfortable with your anatomy and you kind of have a good sense of where all the muscle structure is and how it should be placed in perspective, then you can start dabbling into this more contour gesture drawing. But before that, I would keep it simple and just work with the simple, straights and curves of internal gesture, and just try to dabble in that area first. All right, and that's it. That's actually all I wanted to discuss today. So I'm not sure if you guys have any questions or... Oh, maybe one last thing before I read the questions. On the topic of this internal gesture drawing, the cool thing to make scenes look dynamic is actually this method, because they use it in animation all the time, is that they'll have one gesture interacting with another. And you've probably seen this before, but... so what they'll do if they have fighting characters, for instance, it's that they will have one gesture like this and then another like this. right? So this line is interacting with that line, and then they just build characters around that. Best way to learn proportion. Definitely check out the figure simplification video on the tutorial section of the website, Tanya. There I explain all the proportions of the body and how you can use them in your mannequins, and using that with simple mannequins is definitely the best way to practice it. I just want to say thank you so much. Oh, okay. Thank you, Anna. And you can check out the other classroom sessions on the website under the tutorial section now. I'm recording all of these and I'm just uploading them for you to revisit. Can we start with stick figures if we can make them look dynamic? Sure, Mac. Absolutely. That's actually a great way to practice your gesture drawing, making very dynamic stick figures. And then it just becomes a practice of adding volume to that. So basically, if you look at the advanced artists, right, some of the great comic book artists and stuff like that, the way they learn is kind of in reverse. So they learn about all the volumes, like I tell you here about how, you know, the cylinder works and, you know, how perspective works. And then the more advanced they get, the more they forget about that volume and just use shape to represent their figure. But they've become so experienced with it that regardless of them, instead of using a very well-rounded cylinder, them just using a graphic shape, they're so experienced doing that they can still add little hints of volume here and there to make it look three-dimensional and make it look volumetric. Okay, but that just comes with experience. So first, try to learn it you know, I wouldn't say the boring way, but try to learn it with the simplified way, adding gesture to a simple basic mannequin, and then you can always increase the complexity or increase the simplification to add interest to your designs. One thing that I sometimes struggle with is integrating the overall gesture with the straights versus curves of the smaller shapes. Yeah, I think Ricpio, the straights versus curves is also a bit more advanced. In a lot of beginner tutorials, they talk about it very early on. I'm not sure why, because it's, in my opinion, it's like polishing up a turd, right? If there's nothing there in terms of construction, adding the most beautiful lines, like I said in the previous classroom session with, you know, the brushstrokes that Kim Young-ji uses, or for the eye, if there's no understanding, you can add the most beautiful balance of or curves versus straights or lines of beauty or, you know, whatever. It doesn't save your piece. So focus first, Ricpio, on the understanding of your mannequin, of your volume, of your perspective. Once you get that down, then it just, if you're very confident with drawing mannequins like this, for instance, then you can worry about, okay, maybe I want a curved line here and then a straight one here, you know, to set that off. And I want that curve to follow into this curve and then maybe a straight here. That's all good and well, but that comes from understanding, right? So I wouldn't worry about it in the beginning. Or you're not a beginner, but even at your level, I wouldn't worry about it too much. That also comes naturally. Adding structure to the gesture without losing the original gesture. Is that the case of exaggerating the gesture to compensate? Yes and no, Halftree. So we always exaggerate the gesture, like I did here, right? This is a super exaggerated spine, let's say, and super exaggerated gesture for the legs. But even this can still become stiff if we use very stiff shapes. So that's what I say about trying to manipulate your basic shapes first. Instead of drawing an arm with straight cylinders like this, right? We'll try to draw an arm that's a bit more gestural, right? It still has the same volume and sense of perspective, but we're basically manipulating how we bend those shapes. And because those shapes, depending the way you manipulate those shapes, is following your gesture, your mannequin will become more dynamic again. Last thing you said makes a lot of sense to me. Do the pose first. Yeah, well, I'm glad it does. All right. Well, if there aren't any further questions, I'm going to head off.